Hello and welcome to this lecture on quantitative research and quantitative methodology. So in this first lecture, we're going to focus in a few concepts that are important and also on something that for quantitative research is key, which is the sample. So let's start with the first point. I want to discuss this a little bit more. I know that I think we did it in person. We discussed this idea of the difference between primary data and secondary data, but I think it's important to quickly go through it. Remember that primary data is data that you create with different methods like that exist, for example, experiments and surveys. So thing like primary data before you did something didn't exist. It only exists because of you creating it. And secondary data is data that already existed somewhere, like for example in publications, in reports, data sets, internal records, company information. So secondary data is data that already existed and you are using it to do an analysis. So keep that in mind because we will focus a lot on primary data today. We're going to focus on how to create primary data that is useful for quantitative methodologies. So moving forward with the concept that we will discuss in this video, the sample, how to identify and how to create or identify and define a sample in quantitative research is important that we understand two concepts, sample and also the population. I think it's not that difficult to understand the difference. Population is mm, the group of people or group of individuals or the type of data that you are, because it can also be an organization, the number of organizations. So it is the group of data that you are interested on analyzing. So for example, if you want to study um, human behavior in a way, then what's your population? Well, all humans that exist, 8 billion or something like that. So that's your whole population, everyone. So depending on what you want to study, the population will change. That's why generally we try to narrow a little bit more. Maybe your research topic is not on all humans. It's not about all humans in the world. Maybe you want to focus only on managers, for example, or only on people that work in business, or only accountants. So then you reduce your population. You can also reduce by, for example, um, you can reduce the geographical location again. Maybe you can say only accountants in Sweden, and then your population is much smaller. So you need to be careful on when you discuss your topic and your research problem, you need to reflect which is the population that you are required to study. Is it every human or is it every organization, or do you have like kind of filters and limitations? Usually it's a good idea to limit the population. And linked to that, once that you define your population, you need to be careful because then it's not possible or it's not good that you exclude someone from the population that you're studying. For example, if you're studying accountants in Sweden, it's not like a good practice to maybe remove the accountants from Deloitte. You will need to have a very strong justification to do that. So generally, when we have a population, we try to be general in a way, but with certain limitations that you can add. And then the other concept is the sample. The sample is a subset of the population, so it's a smaller group. And the idea is that why do we have sample and population? The ideal situation is that you can analyze your whole population. You can analyze and test with everyone in the population that you define. That's the ideal. But in practice, that is difficult to happen. In practice, you only have access to a limited size of that population. Not everyone will answer to your survey. Maybe there is not data for everyone. So in that sense, you need to analyze only the sample. That's why this exists, sample and population. But then, if that is what happens, that is in practice what happens, then we need to make sure that the sample behaves similar and is also similar to the population. So again, if you want to study all the accountants in Sweden, you need to make sure that your sample, the number of accountants that you will study, will be similar to that population. So maybe again, in the sample, you need to make sure that you have like a similar distribution of male and female, a similar distribution of how how like the tenure they have, like how much experience they have. You cannot have only the young ones because then it doesn't fit with sample and population. So be careful with that distinction. And maybe I just discussed a little bit this population aspect and that you have to have limitations to reduce the number because otherwise it will be 8 billion your population. So what are some suggestions when you kind of limit and choose your population? So make sure that the population is connected to your research objective and your research problem. It can be difficult to maybe set it on the first time. So again, it's also an iterative process that you need to work on and on and on. Then the next thing is that although maybe for you it is clear, like maybe you are like, it's clear my research problem aims to understand accountants in Sweden, you still need to justify when you write why this population fits with the research problem. And then in the end, we already discussed in the topic, in the research topic lecture, the accessibility of the data will also kind of guide you where to go and where not to go. Maybe your research problem should indicate that you should also include maybe accountants from all the countries in the north, including maybe Finland, but then maybe it's difficult to access Finland. So then you need to rethink a research problem that fits with the data that you can access. And this happens all the time. Like it's always iteration process. You set your problem and then you discuss your population, but then you realize your population will guide you to a different problem. So again, iteration in research, very important. Then if we go to the other concept, to the sample, a very important aspect that we need to discuss is how big the sample should be in order to make it valid. Because if you have population of 8 billion people, if you want to study everyone, how large the sample should be. The quick answer to that is that it should be consistent and coherent. The larger the population is, the larger the sample. Because if you want to generalize for uh, 8 billion people, you cannot trust how 10 people behave, right? Like you cannot generalize for everyone in the world just by studying 10 people. If your population is smaller, then your sample could be smaller. That is why I think in here it's important to keep in mind that make sure that you can limit a bit because if you want to study everyone in the world, you will need a huge sample. So maybe you can reduce a little bit your population, like again, maybe only accountants, maybe junior accountants only in Sweden. They need to check how many junior accountants in Sweden exist. Let's say there are 10,000. So 10,000 is your population. Then you need to find a number that is more or less coherent with that 10,000. How many accountants do you need to study in order to generalize? Like the behavior of this number of accountants can be extrapolated to the whole population. So generally, again, the best answer to that is the the biggest or the largest the sample, the better. But then we have a challenge. Maybe it will be difficult to access all the 10,000 or 9,000, maybe because 9,000 will be also a great number, but maybe it's difficult to get 9,000 survey results. So because of that, then maybe we should focus on what's the minimum requirement, like which is the minimum that we can use. And here the answer is tricky. I think in the end, every type of research requires its own justification and reasoning, but generally, some statistical research in business administration and in social sciences says that around 380 responses is a very good number in most cases. It works well in most cases. However, in accounting, especially in management accounting, because it's more difficult to access data, generally quantitative studies also can work with around 100 responses. So it's very difficult to tell you. There is not like a minimum quota, but these are more or less some benchmarks. From a book on research methods in business administration, I borrowed this table, which you can more or less link How big is your population? For example, from the 10,000 accountants, they suggest 370. That's their suggestion, and you can base your sample size based on this, but also you can justify like maybe it's difficult to access different things. And we can also do some statistical tests to explain that it still works, but maybe keep these three numbers in mind. The ideal, number one, the ideal, the larger the better. Number two, around 380 because of this paper from 50 years ago. And last resource, at least 100, which is actually what we will aim with our study, the one that we will do in the group, in the group assignment. So this is some basic information regarding sample and population. In the next videos, we will talk about other concepts that are also very important.